After His Majesty entrusted Catherine and me with the royal finances, we identified serious concerns regarding Mrs. Annabel Elliot. An investigation is underway. Misuse of royal assets will be met with full accountability, regardless of family ties.
King Charles watched the woman he spent half a century defending get escorted out of Clarence House with less than 36 hours' notice. And this time, the reason had nothing to do with secret Swiss accounts or Cayman Islands shells. This time, it was the charities, the ones she had spent 2 decades polishing into a public image of quiet, tireless goodness. The ones the nation had been told were her redemption story, the ones that turned out to be the most carefully constructed financial weapon the modern monarchy had ever seen. Before we go any further, if you're new to this channel, hit subscribe. The investigation remains active and new documents continue to emerge, and the palace is in full damage control mode. You are going to want the updates the moment they land. The public statement was released late on July 30th, 2026, only after an extraordinary Privy Council session. Parliamentary approval and royal assent had completed the final legal steps. Not the usual carefully worded Buckingham Palace release, not the kind that requires 3 reads and a constitutional lawyer to decode. This one was blunt, almost brutal. His Majesty the King has today confirmed the immediate removal of Camilla Parker Bowles from her royal patronages following the completion of parliamentary and Privy Council procedures. Serious and sustained irregularities have been identified in the administration of multiple charitable entities under her direction, including attempts to consolidate control over the principal royal trusts. Continuation of her current roles has been deemed incompatible with the integrity of the crown. They used her pre-marriage name again. That was the first signal that the marriage itself was already over in every way that mattered. What followed was the fastest institutional excision of a senior royal in modern memory. And the people who made it possible were not palace lawyers or forensic accountants. They were 2 women who had spent years watching Camilla operate from the inside, the Duchess of Edinburgh and the Princess Royal. Here is how it actually unfolded: the quiet capture plan. For years, the public narrative was simple. Camilla had redeemed herself through charity, osteoporosis, literacy, animal welfare, domestic violence. The list grew longer every year. She was photographed opening centers, reading to children, standing next to survivors. The press called it her quiet revolution. Behind the photographs, something else was happening. Beginning in late 2023, Camilla's private office began a methodical campaign to bring every major royal trust and foundation under a single coordinating body. The proposed name was the Queen's Charitable Consolidation Board. On paper, it sounded efficient: one streamlined structure, reduced duplication, better oversight. In reality, it was a power grab of extraordinary ambition. The plan, according to internal memos later recovered, would have given Camilla's office effective operational control over the Prince of Wales's charitable fund, the Duke of Edinburgh's award and associated trusts, the Princess Royal's extensive portfolio of patronages and funds, the Queen's Trust, the residual body from Queen Elizabeth's personal charities, several smaller but cash-rich family foundations linked to the Duchy of Lancaster and the Duchy of Cornwall. If successful, Camilla would have sat at the apex of a charitable empire controlling well over £180 million in annual income and several hundred million in endowments. She would have decided which causes received money, which directors stayed or went, and most critically, which financial intermediaries handled the transfers. Princess Anne noticed first. Anne has never been sentimental about titles or soft language. In the autumn of 2025, she began receiving quiet complaints from long-serving staff at 2 of her own charities. New advisory consultants, all recommended by Camilla's office, were inserting themselves into decision-making. Grant applications that had previously been approved in weeks were suddenly delayed for alignment reviews. Money that used to move through established British banks was being routed through a little-known Luxembourg-based entity called Meridian Heritage Partners. Anne asked for the paperwork. She was given the runaround. Then Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, started noticing the same pattern in the Duke of Edinburgh's award network and in several smaller trusts she and Edward had supported for years. Sophie is quieter than Anne, but no less precise. She began keeping her own file, bank statements, email chains, meeting notes. She compared them with what Anne had collected. By early December 2025, the two women had enough to take to the king's private secretary. Rather than alerting the king immediately, the palace authorized a months-long confidential forensic review to avoid tipping off anyone connected to the network. At the same time, senior constitutional advisors quietly began preparing contingency legal measures should the investigation ultimately confirm the allegations, allowing immediate action if the king decided intervention was unavoidable. The forensic review formally commenced before Christmas 2025 under strict confidentiality. Investigators quietly expanded the inquiry throughout the first half of 2026 before presenting Charles with the preliminary findings and the core evidence. The king's private secretary insisted the evidence remain tightly contained until investigators could establish whether the network extended beyond Camilla's office. The architecture of the diversion. The months-long forensic review that followed was led by an independent firm brought in under the strictest confidentiality. What they found was a classic layered structure designed to look legitimate while systematically siphoning value. At the top sat 3 flagship charities publicly associated with Camilla. Their published accounts looked clean enough for the charity commission. Below them, however, sat a network of intermediate entities. 2 UK-registered companies whose sole directors were longtime members of Camilla's private staff. A Luxembourg SOPARFI that received consultancy and strategic advisory fees, a Cayman Islands foundation that held restricted endowment funds, a Swiss fiduciary that managed donor-advised accounts. Money entered the system as perfectly ordinary donations or grants. A portion, sometimes as little as 8%, sometimes as much as 22%, was then paid out as professional fees, impact assessment costs, or international partnership development. Those fees traveled through the intermediate companies and ended up in accounts that were, on paper, controlled by the charities, but in practice directed by a very small circle of people around Camilla. The absolute amounts were not eye-watering by the standards of international philanthropy. Over a 3-year period, the diverted total was estimated at between £11.4 million and £14.7 million. What made it explosive was the pattern and the ambition. Some of the largest single transfers coincided with periods when Camilla was hosting private dinners or listening events attended by wealthy individuals whose businesses later received favorable mentions in royal speeches or access to palace events. No direct quid pro quo was proven in the initial report. The timing, however, was described by one investigator as statistically non-random to a degree that would be laughed out of any serious compliance review. Worse, the same structure had begun to reach into the older royal trusts. Staff at the Prince of Wales's charitable fund reported pressure to adopt the new centralized payment protocols. Similar pressure appeared at the Duke of Edinburgh's award. In one internal email recovered from Camilla's office, a senior aide wrote, "Once the consolidation board is live, the legacy trusts become administrative units. Decision rights move upstairs. Upstairs meant Camilla, the night the king learned the truth." Charles was briefed on the evening of 24th July 2026 at Windsor. Present were the private secretary, the keeper of the privy purse, Princess Anne, and Sophie. William was deliberately kept out of the room for the first 90 minutes so that the king could absorb the material without the added weight of his heir's reaction. Those who were there described Charles as initially skeptical, almost angry at the suggestion. He had defended Camilla's charitable work for years. He had watched her rebuild public affection through those very organizations. The idea that the same work was the vehicle for systematic diversion felt to him like a personal attack on the only part of her public life that had ever been widely praised. Anne did not soften the presentation. She walked him through the documents page by page, the fee schedules, the Luxembourg invoices that listed strategic alignment services at £180,000 a quarter, with no deliverables attached, The Cayman Foundation, whose beneficial ownership chain ended in a nominee company controlled by a solicitor who had previously handled Camilla's personal affairs. The emails in which Camilla's office instructed charity staff to ensure future large gifts are routed through the preferred intermediary for proper stewardship. Then Sophie spoke. She is not given to theatrical language. She simply said that the pattern was identical across every trust she and Edward had visibility of, and that if the Consolidation Board had been allowed to proceed, the entire royal charitable apparatus would have been under the operational control of people whose primary loyalty was to Camilla rather than to the institutions themselves. Charles asked the question that mattered most to him. Does any of this money end up in her personal accounts? The answer was carefully worded. Direct transfers into accounts in Camilla's own name had not been found. What had been found were payments into entities that provided her with lifestyle benefits, private travel, security enhancements beyond the official allocation, and the quiet settlement of certain family financial pressures that the official civil list and duchy income were not intended to cover. In other words, not crude theft, sophisticated enrichment. Charles sat in silence for a long time. Then he asked for the full file to be left with him overnight. The confrontation. The meeting at Clarence House the following evening lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes. Only the 2 protection officers remained within earshot. Everyone else was sent away. Charles did not begin with anger. He began with the documents laid out in chronological order across the desk that had once been his mother's. He asked Camilla to explain the Luxembourg fees. She offered the standard lines: professional advice, complex international structures, best practice in modern philanthropy. He asked her to explain why the same firm appeared in the accounts of 3 separate charities she controlled and was now being recommended to the older royal trusts. She said it was efficiency. He asked her why a Cayman foundation that had never made a public grant was receiving 6-figure transfers labeled as endowment protection. She said the legal advice had been clear. Then he asked the question that broke the careful performance. Were you trying to take control of every trust that still carries the names of my mother, my father, and my son? Camilla's answer, according to the only account that has reached people outside the room, was that the monarchy's charitable landscape was fragmented and outdated, that someone had to modernize it, and that she was the only person both willing and positioned to do so. Charles's reply was quiet and final. You were positioning yourself to decide which parts of this family's legacy survived and which parts were quietly redirected. That is not modernization. That is capture. The rest of the conversation is known only in fragments, raised voices, accusations of ingratitude, claims that everything had been done to protect the institution from naive traditionalists. At one point, Camilla is said to have told Charles that if he moved against her, he would look vindictive and unstable. He answered that the alternative was to leave the crown complicit in the largest quiet raid on its own charitable infrastructure in living memory. When she left the study, she was no longer queen consort in any practical sense. The legal formalities would take less than a week. The personal reality was already settled, the institutional execution. The speed that followed was deliberate. Anne and Sophie had insisted on one condition when they brought the file. If the king acted, he had to act completely. Half measures would leave the same networks in place under different names. Charles agreed. Earlier that day, on July 30th, the Privy Council had been summoned for an extraordinary session. The evidence was presented in summarized but unsparing form. The legal advice was that continuation of Camilla's patronages and any residual coordinating role created unacceptable reputational and fiduciary risk to the Crown. Emergency legislation was prepared with cross-party agreement, the same mechanism used months earlier when Andrew's titles were removed. It was narrower this time. It revoked the specific letters, patent, and appointments that had given Camilla authority over the Consolidation Board project and over the charities she directly controlled. It also authorized the immediate appointment of independent administrators to every affected trust. The vote in Parliament was not unanimous, but it was decisive. Several MPs expressed unease at the precedent of the monarch using emergency procedure against his own wife. Others said the alternative, allowing a senior royal to attempt a quiet takeover of the family's charitable assets, was worse. Royal assent was given the same night. Camilla Parker Bowles left Clarence House on the morning of July 31st. She was driven to a privately rented property in Wiltshire. Her remaining honorary military appointments were suspended pending further review. Every charity that had carried her name as royal patron received a formal letter stating that the patronage had been withdrawn with immediate effect. The human cost inside the family. William's reaction was complex. He had never been close to Camilla, but he had watched his father rebuild a life with her. He also understood better than most how fragile public trust in the monarchy's finances had become. His public statement was brief and supportive of the institutional decision. Privately, he is said to have told his father that the speed was necessary, but that the personal destruction would follow Charles for the rest of his reign. Catherine found herself accelerated into the senior female role she had expected to grow into more gradually. Friends describe her as professional and controlled in public, privately worried about the long-term damage to the idea that royal marriages could still be partnerships of genuine trust. Sophie and Anne have said almost nothing on the record. The few people who have spoken to them describe a shared sense of grim necessity rather than triumph. Both women had worked for decades inside the system Camilla had tried to re-engineer. Both understood that once the pattern was visible, inaction would have made them complicit. Charles himself has aged visibly. Those who see him at close range say the mechanical precision of his public duties remains. But the private engagement that once characterized him has thinned. He moved permanently into a smaller set of rooms at Buckingham Palace. Clarence House is being prepared for other use, the wider fallout. The Charity Commission opened its own formal inquiry within days. Several of the intermediate companies are under investigation for possible breaches of fiduciary duty. No criminal charges have yet been laid against Camilla herself. The structures were carefully enough designed that proving personal criminal intent remains difficult. The reputational verdict, however, has already been delivered by the institution that once protected her. Public reaction split along familiar lines. Older supporters who had slowly accepted Camilla after the long wilderness years expressed discomfort at the severity. Younger voices and those who had always remained skeptical treated the episode as delayed accountability. International coverage was mixed. Some outlets framed it as a necessary cleansing, others as evidence that the British monarchy remains capable of turning on its own with startling ruthlessness when institutional survival is at stake. Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes issued a joint statement defending their mother's intentions and insisting that any irregularities were the result of over-complex advice rather than deliberate misconduct. The statement was dignified and clearly heartfelt. It did not address the Consolidation Board documents or the pattern of intermediate fees, what the episode actually reveals. This was never only about money. 11 or 14 million pounds diverted through charitable structures is serious, but it is not the kind of sum that brings down a monarchy. What made the situation intolerable was the direction of travel. Camilla had spent years constructing an image of selfless service. Behind that image, she had been building an apparatus that would have allowed her to sit permanently at the center of the royal family's financial and philanthropic power, deciding which legacies were funded, which were starved, and which intermediaries took their cut along the way. Princess Anne and the Duchess of Edinburgh stopped that process while it was still incomplete. The king chose the institution over the marriage he had fought the entire country to legitimize. Whether history will call that choice necessary or cruel is not yet settled. What is already clear is that the woman who once seemed to have completed the longest and most improbable rehabilitation in modern royal history has been removed from every formal position of influence she held, and the charitable machinery she tried to centralize is being dismantled and rebuilt under different hands. The crown protected itself. The personal cost is being paid in the quiet rooms of Buckingham Palace and in a rented house in Wiltshire by two people who once believed they had finally outlasted every storm. Sometimes the most dangerous threats to an ancient institution do not come from outside. They come from the person who has spent decades learning exactly how the machinery works and who decides, late in life, that the machinery should answer to them alone.